Friedrich Nietzsche, the greatest moral philosopher since the 1804, had the thought of the eternal recurrence in August 1881, a month into his first of 7 stays in Sils Maria. Sils is amazing. I stayed there for a while 20 years ago. I recommend it, but it can sometimes be a bit touristy. This is how Nietzsche records his first thought of the eternal recurrence in his mostly sane autobiography, Ecce Homo. The thought of eternal return belongs to August of the year 1881. That day, I went through the wood to the lake of Silvaplana. I stopped near Surley by a huge pyramidical boulder. That is where the thought of the eternal return came to me. In this episode, we're going to discover what the thought absolutely does not mean, despite what a lot of people on YouTube say.
I'm having those late night, existential sort of thoughts.
And we're going to look at what the thought really means and what the implications are for you affirming your life and affirming the world in which you find yourself without being overwhelmed either by its horror or by its mundaneness. Let's go. So you might say, well, I like this Nietzsche guy, the Sils Maria place looks cool and the rock is interesting, so tell me more about this idea of the eternal return, the eternal recurrence. Where do I find out about it more? Well, I've prepared some references to the primary literature for you, and you can find them just by stopping the screen here. Now, one place not to start reading about the Nietzschean idea of the eternal recurrence is in this book called The Will to Power, because this is not quite a book by Nietzsche. It's an important document and it contains Nietzsche's own notes, but they are organized in a manipulative and exploitative way by his very badly behaving anti-Semitic sister when Nietzsche was already neurologically gone or dead. Now, if you do get your idea of the eternal return from this book, there is a potential that you will come away thinking that Nietzsche intended the idea cosmologically and scientifically. That's to say that he literally thought that the world repeated itself infinitely many times in exactly the same way, that the world has already repeated itself infinitely many times in exactly the same way, and that the world will continue repeating itself infinitely many times in exactly the same way. Now, you're welcome to explore more deeply the arguments for why Nietzsche couldn't have really thought that, at least when he was remotely at his best and sane, and for that you can pause the screen here too. But the point that really matters here is that if it looks like we're attributing a silly idea to a relatively recent writer of genius, then either what's gone wrong is something with the expression of the writer, which isn't conveying the writer's intentions, or something has gone wrong with our reading and interpretation. And of course, with Nietzsche, you have to realize that he is a great stylist, that he is a great user of hyperbole, and that he is a man who was keen to protect his writings from any kind of excessive theoretical interpretation or from incorporation into the academy. And so we've got to be profoundly sensitive about the way we understand what's going on in Nietzsche and what he really means behind what he says. As always, the best place to start are the greatest works in Nietzsche's corpus, and one of them is, of course, the gay science. And here, above all, in section 341, Nietzsche puts front and center the idea of the eternal recurrence. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and every sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself, the eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and everything, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. Or how well disposed would you have to become toward yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate confirmation and seal? Now that we've got Nietzsche's question to face, do you want this again and again? Before we apply it to your life, we've got to get a bit of help from a beautiful colleague, Alexander Nehamas. Alexander Nehamas helped Nietzsche enter English-speaking philosophy in 1985 when he brought out his book Life as Literature. And it helped many even older colleagues connect into Nietzsche and be free to engage with him on a deeper level and much more openly. I mean, that was even true of my beloved Bernard Williams, with whom my own work is in many ways continuous. So the first idea we want to get help from Alexander on is Nietzsche's thought that you can't just go into your past, remove an event, and insert some hypothetical alternative instead of that event without actually that affecting everything else, especially if that event is significant. So Alexander.
Nietzsche says, if anything was different, everything would be different. You don't have any atomistic events in life. Everything is interconnected.
And now over and above this assumption that if you change anything, you're going to change everything, lies an aspiration that is for Nietzsche at the very heart of the idea of the eternal recurrence, which, as we are now beginning to see, is for him a thought experiment. And the aspiration is this: the ideal human life is a life that maximally approximates to a situation where the person leading that life does not want to change anything significant about his or her life.
You want everything that is important in your life to be such that you wouldn't want it to be different. That is the point of Nietzsche's.
So how do we apply this aspiration to our lives now and do it in a way that doesn't attribute anything silly to Nietzsche? Because Nietzsche, of course, is not denying the tragic element of life. He is precisely affirming it. And I'm going to say this 3 times in a row because it's so important. These are my words, not Nietzsche's. Life gives you things you didn't ask for. Life gives you things you didn't ask for. Life gives you things you didn't ask for. Nietzsche is not running away from this truth by saying that everything is always for the best of all worlds. The opposite. He's saying that is precisely true and tragic. But how do we talk about facing that in a life that is hit in various ways by all kinds of contingencies, but is nevertheless a life in which the individual says, I still wouldn't change anything significant about it. Now we need one final qualification here from Alexander Nehamas, who added an important detail that in fact he didn't manage to add in his original book.
I wasn't quite right. In other words, I don't think that we can assume that a past event, whatever it is absolutely over once and for all. Which of course depends on that event having an absolutely determinate beginning and an absolutely determinate end. It started then, and then it ended then, and that can't change anymore.
So the point Alexander is making there is that an event isn't over as long as we continue to interpret what it is in the light of other things that happen in our lives. So take an example. Imagine you've separated from a former partner at some point in your past. Well, what that event is, what that event means, depends on what happens after. If you formed a profoundly magical life partnership, that's one kind of eventuality. If you, in fact, failed to form a fulfilling relationship since that separation, well, that's going to change what that separation means. Much more trivially, let's ask a question: when did I begin making this video? Now you might say, well, I began making this video 35 minutes ago. But didn't I begin making this video a couple of hours ago when I had some thoughts about Nietzsche? Or perhaps I began making this video even earlier than that, when I began to think seriously about Nietzsche. Well, when did I begin to think seriously about Nietzsche? Was it in 1997 when I read Zarathustra? Or was it during my visit to Sils when I was reading Nietzsche's finer works and visiting his archive? Was it somewhere in between when I was walking with some Nietzsche obsessive in the Black Forest when I was staying in Freiburg, and neither he nor me knew with any real sophistication what Nietzsche was all about? So when did this video begin? That depends in part on what account we give of it, and that's going to be an interpretive matter, not just a factual matter. Now we're in a position to ask ourselves about our lives. Well, how do we move toward, and do we want to move toward, saying that there's nothing significant in our lives that we want to change? What are the issues that this goes to the heart of for you? Please feel free to share in the comments. I want to share a couple of personal ones with you. My closest friend died 10 years ago. I still speak to him every day, and we have a very positive, humorous relationship, and I elaborate his life for him in a way that's maximally faithful to what he may have been had he been here. And he died suddenly of an undiagnosed medical condition. Now, part of me accepts his death, but part of me refuses to accept his death, and I like that. And I don't necessarily want to move toward a situation where I say, actually, that's something I don't want to change. What do you mean you don't want to change it? I want this damn young man's life back. It's unacceptable what happened to him, unforgivable. Schubert died at 31. It's not forgivable. I mean, I'm not impressed with that. I'm not impressed with the fabric of the universe that generates that result. No. Sorry, that's my answer. Take another example. For a few years of my life, I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk, I couldn't read. I was in considerable degree of suffering through a very serious neurological condition, neuroimmune condition. Now, I'm now much better from that condition, but I went through that suffering, and moreover now, I am significantly limited by this condition, such that most hours every single day I actually still lose. I'm still not able to function for the majority of the hours in a day. What do I say about that? Now, this is going to be deeply dived into by us in another episode in the Nietzsche series, which is actually going to be about, and it's a requested episode by somebody who very kindly got this microphone for this channel. And the requested episode is on the issue of how bodily suffering impacts the intellectual patterns of your mind. And we're going to use Nietzsche as an example to talk through this really fascinating question. It's a brilliant question to ask. And now, what's interesting is that Nietzsche's biographical view, and here we can be definitely confident, was that on balance, even though his illness was hell, and we're going to sort of diagnose him as well, even though his illness was hell, he said it was for the better. And he gave all kinds of reasons about even how being unable to work as often as he would like made him work differently, made him work better, made him write better, made him write better philosophy. Do we believe him? We're going to explore all of this. So this is how this requirement that you aspire at least to move toward a situation where you no longer want to change anything significant in your life. That's how this requirement works. Now, of course, what I have just suggested is that arriving at the final terminus where you really don't want to change anything significant in your life isn't necessarily a destination that we should aim for. We're now reaching the heart of the matter. And because we're reaching the heart of the matter, we should be brief because the heart is something you should keep coming back to. But Nietzsche says, look, it's hard to say yes to the world because what's good and what's bad in the world are constitutively connected. Let's take some examples. The statue of Cecil Rhodes at Oriel College, Oxford. There's been an argument that it should go down. Why? Because Rhodes engaged in all kinds of really ugly colonial activity in the 1890s in Africa. At the same time, a lot of women and ethnic minorities have benefited from the Rhodes Scholarship. Nietzsche would say, you have to appreciate that here the good and the bad sit together, and you're denying not just human history but actually reality when you bring this statue down. You don't get to do it. You get to go away and reflect on getting your shit together and facing reality. Statues are staying up for Nietzsche. Now, that's not the most perfect extrapolation simply because Nietzsche is a genius moral philosopher, but his political thought is poor. His genius runs out when it comes to politics.
His genius probably to that extent dries up.
Let's take another example. You believe that all human beings are of equal moral worth. Well, that's a relatively recent outlook that's 2 or 3 centuries old. Now, that outlook is an historical derivation from centuries upon centuries upon centuries of very different kinds of outlook, which absolutely denied and didn't recognize your thing about human beings all being of equal moral worth. The one thing has derived from the other, has come from the other, and wouldn't exist without it. To have your lovely outlook of equal moral worth, you also have to accept a world in which it's denied for centuries upon centuries upon centuries upon centuries. And then, with many concepts, Nietzsche thinks that there is a kind of very complex, ineliminable combination of good and bad. Let's take one example, truthfulness. Now, Nietzsche thinks that there's all kinds of marvelous things, and in fact intrinsically marvelous things, to be had from having a truthful relation to the world. At the same time, various kinds of truthfulness might be potentially even civilization destroying. For example, it might be that we are dependent on certain cultural practices or even on certain institutions, a truthful understanding of which would undermine them, such that truthfully we can't take something seriously or justify it, and yet it might be necessary to our social organization, a problem. So this is how this conversation proceeds, and this is why it's difficult but desirable to say yes and justify life. I've read the YouTube rulebook, and apparently you have to finish a Nietzsche episode with a story. So let's end with a little story. And do not take this to be a commentary on the Israeli-Palestinian political crisis.
There was a famous question that he asked all his friends, at least the Jewish friends. He asked, if you have an Aladdin lamp and you can rub the lamp and the Jews will disappear and become Scandinavian. All Scandinavians happily, healthy, without worries, without being hated. Would you rub? And I said, too hastily, no, I wouldn't. And he thought that my haste is a problem with me, namely not realizing the way of suffering. That basically by just poo-pooing this opportunity right away of heaven is not taking Jewish suffering seriously enough.
What Isaiah Berlin wanted isn't for you to say no or for you to say, yes, I will become a Dane. In fact, he wanted you to say no, but that's less important. What's most important is he did not want you to answer that question too quickly. And that's, of course, what Nietzsche wants from you with his thought experiment of the eternal recurrence. He wants to say, are you going to say yes to all of this, or are you not? And please don't say yes or no too quickly. Sit on this. And of course, it's not an accident that Nietzsche loves asking you the question, is this what you want? Indeed, that's how he ends his extraordinary book, The Gay Science. He says, is this what you want? And that's what he is leaving with you. And he is wagging his finger at you and saying, ahaha, do not give me a 5-second answer one way or the other. This is something you're going to sit on. This is something you're going to percolate. This is something you're going to live with. And this is something you're going to ongoingly answer and re-answer and ask and re-ask. And of course, when you're a genius, you can make minor slips. And one of the minor technical slips with this thought experiment, of course, is that actually it's enough to repeat the whole thing once. In other words, if there's a real problem with rerunning the story infinitely, that's probably just going to be a problem with running it just one more time. That's going to cover it. So do you want to run it again might be enough to get Nietzsche what he wants in terms of the thought experiment of the eternal recurrence. The next video you should watch on this channel is going to be the next video in the Nietzsche series when it's going to be up. Until it's up, this is the next video you should watch.